So let's talk about the market first of all. So the geopolitical situation around uranium, you've got some very passionate people out there. It's a very sensitive subject. The psychology and the psyche behind it is quite an emotive one. So tell me about who you think the main players are, and and how that would impact on Bannerman going forward.
Well, in a very broad sense, we are, I believe, on the cusp of a very broad policy realisation that the clean energy imperative is a must. There's growing and irrefutable evidence that regardless of your belief on what the causation is, we need to address climate change and we need to address man's contribution going forward to that. Now, what's happening just in the recent months is a recognition that renewables can't provide the whole answer. We had a few years of very optimistic projections on renewables. I've worked in the renewables sector, so I feel like I've got a good understanding of how it works. And the truth is renewables do have to play a very important role in decarbonising our various economies, but they simply can't provide the exclusive solution.
Okay, so just if I might just interrupt there a second. So can you just define, given you've worked in both spaces, can you articulate the difference between renewable energy and nuclear, which is positioning itself as a green energy?
So I would divide it along the lines of intermittent renewable energy sources and baseload renewable energy sources. So of course with intermittent, it's predominantly the various forms of solar and offshore, onshore wind. Other technologies, tidal, etc., just aren't proven yet, and it's a long way off before we're really going to know if wave tidal, etc., are going to play much of a role at all. And there is an urgency here, which I think is driving nuclear policy. The baseload sources of clean power are really only nuclear and, of course, hydro. And what we're seeing is a broad acceptance that hydro comes with a very substantial, tangible cost. And that cost is both in the form of direct environmental damage that's caused by dams and the rather significant legacy that we've seen, but also social and geopolitical costs. When we look at some of the hydro projects that are planned in Central and East Asia, for example, in many instances, those projects have got implications for multiple countries downstream. And we've got some very unfortunate legacy examples of where poorly planned hydro projects have had devastating environmental and social impacts. And so when I look at the energy perspective in a very broad sense with this clean energy imperative, there is a huge gap of what is currently being invested in nuclear and what needs to be, if as a society and a civilization we have got any chance of arresting the current climate trajectory.
So, I mean, given uranium is it will at some point become a depleted resource, do you think nuclear is an intermediary energy source, baseload source for now, whilst people work out how to efficiently harness the renewable side of things?
To an extent it is, but the filler is a multi-decade filler. So it's not a solution just for the next 5 or 10 years until storage comes in and saves all of the downsides and issues associated with intermittent renewables and their negative impact on grid stability. It is a multi-decade solution, and interestingly, it's multi-decade solution for itself. So if we start to project many decades forward, when we do start to see uranium resources around the world come under terminated pressure, there is a resource sitting out there which benefits civilization in two different ways, and that is nuclear waste. The technology does exist to extract further benefit and energy out of nuclear waste. That waste is very safely and securely stored, waiting for that day. And the piece of the puzzle that's missing is it just simply isn't commercial to extract that energy source from that nuclear waste. So when you look at it that way, I don't think it's preposterous at all to talk about nuclear energy as becoming a renewable form of energy in the same way that bioenergy works on maize fields waste or sugarcane waste to make energy.
The nuclear sector has been very good at PRing itself over the last 10, 15 years. It's come from a position where people, based on fear, out of the unknown, and obviously a few black swan events, I think they're called in this industry, where people are very nervous about what it could mean to their safety. I mean, how has this PR revolutionized the way that nuclear is being positioned? And obviously, how does that affect companies like you?
Well, I would say that the industry is not very good at talking about itself at all.
Okay.
And the areas in which the nuclear industry has made PR progress has come almost exclusively from two forms. The first form is at a very high level, the nuclear industry has, in just the last couple of years, successfully positioned itself at key policy-making bodies. So the World Nuclear Association now has a seat at the Clean Energy Ministerial, an incredibly important body that will influence government policies around the globe at a time when those factors that I mentioned before in terms of clean energy imperative and the downsides of intermittent renewables are coming into focus. Now, the second area where we are on a positive trajectory in the nuclear industry is actually caused by some very credible environmentalists. A very good example is Michael Schellenberger. He's an environmentalist who has dedicated his life to environmental causes. He was one of the original anti-nuclear campaigners, certainly a climate change activist. And several years ago, he had a very deep dive based on fact, based on economic reality, and based on an assumption that energy growth would continue despite what people might wish it to be. And he came out of that deep dive with the irrefutable evidence that nuclear power offered the ideal solution over and above renewables. Now, it's people like Michael and other people like James Hansen who have that multi-decade credibility in the environmental space where if I call it the moderates in our society, are prepared to really listen carefully to what they've got to say and maintain an open mind and a dialogue. There are, of course, still extremist groups on both sides of politics, but in particular on the environmental side. And I don't think we're ever going to win them across to nuclear power simply because they've got too much organisational and financial infrastructure that is tied to an anti-nuclear position. So those people are unwinnable, but for the vast majority of people who want to see a better world, who are becoming open-minded to the only way that we can achieve that, which is nuclear power playing a role, then I think we are starting to make progress in the PR game. And I just hope it continues and increases because as a civilization, we don't have a lot of time to ponder over these matters.
Okay, interesting thought there. I mean, do you think this is a PR issue or technology advancements have also helped the cause?
It's entirely a PR issue. When you've spent as much time as I have amongst the nuclear industry and amongst the engineers and the extremely clever people who operate in their little niches in this industry, when you've done what I have and visited the world's premier long-term high radioactive waste depositories and just seen the extraordinary levels that they've done to reduce risks down to zero, it's nothing but a PR issue because those facts are absolute. Those risks have been reduced down to something that as a society sits well below all other forms of energy. And statistically, nuclear is still the safest form of energy that we have ever used as a civilization.
With education comes understanding for all matters. But let's move on to an area where the passions rise. So I've spoken to quite a few uranium companies recently. We've got the US companies, it seems, versus the world. Well, there are a few friendly folk in there. I think the US would align themselves to, Australia, Canada, etc. But I think the recent 232, Section 232 proposal from UR Energy and Energy Fuels, use some pretty strong language around their PR, adversarial type commentary, and they position it as a security issue. But I've also spoken to some people across the aisle, as a phrase we use here, who don't necessarily see it that way. I mean, where do you sit in all of this?
So I'd offer a slightly different perspective.
Good.
I think it's an incredibly important issue for the United States. It's not a security issue per se, it is a global relevance issue. It wasn't that long ago that the United States led the world on all things nuclear. And Westinghouse to this day has still built more reactors than any other reactor builder. And to see them take that mantle and a couple of years ago have their flagship industry in bankruptcy speaks volumes to just how far both policymakers and industry in the United States have allowed this flagship industry to deteriorate. And it comes at a time when Russia has really asserted itself with justification as the world's premier equipment supplier. And you have China, who is moving very, very quickly and rapidly and effectively on the heels of Russia, looking to assert itself as number one. And China's got a very strong driver in that. They've got an extremely strong domestic driver because of their clean air imperative and their requirement for baseload energy and the cannibalisation of their coal-based baseload that they need to achieve. But they've got an even bigger driver, and that is the Belt and Road Initiative. And long-term offtake agreements and long-term 80-year partnerships that come with a new nuclear reactor is exactly what China's looking to drive there. So you have two extremely motivated, effective, state-controlled industries that have left the United States relegated behind not only themselves, but also South Korea in this industry. So I think that is far bigger and far more important than the issue of whether or not the United States has got access to fresh uranium to make tritium componentry of their weapons program. And so I think there's a broader approach that the US needs to take to address all of those. And we've seen really in the last few months, the first strong indications that they are in fact prepared to do that with the funding salvation package for Vogtle, some of the innovative funding packages for Gen 4 and SMR reactors, but also the rhetoric. And I find that particularly interesting coming out of Secretary Perry and others.
That's really interesting. We've not heard that thinking before. Certainly with the interviews that I've done, and obviously we are new to this. So can we get into that a bit? Because you were saying that Russia, China, they have taken the lead, as it were, from America, from Westinghouse, and and for whatever reason, the United States have kind of dropped the ball there a bit. Do you think that this 232 issue will save the US uranium businesses, or do you think it was a tactical move by the two companies involved? Obviously, the knock-on effects have been huge, and we'll get onto that in a second with regards to utilities. Do you think that America can recover its situation? Do you think it needs to recover its situation, or should it focus on other ways of dealing with this?
Whether they need to recover really depends on whether America's entering a longer term phase of looking in, or if it will return to looking outside its own borders after we've had administration change, which might well be another several years away. The reason why it's so important from a geopolitical perspective is energy security, as your audience would know, is really one of the absolute hot topics when it comes to geopolitical tension at the moment. We tend to hear about trade, but we've seen in the relatively recent past how Russia has asserted itself on energy security with some of its neighbours. We've seen a huge push by the US to become energy independent, and they're getting very close with their hydrocarbon industry in particular. But we don't have to go back that far in Asia, for example, to see the extraordinary lengths that Japan and others went to for energy security. What is exceptional with nuclear power is the capacity to buy, stockpile uranium in its various forms and be 100% energy secure within your own borders. So one of the calculations that I've seen is Japan's entire nuclear requirements before Fukushima could be stored in a single warehouse, stored, protected, guarded, however you want to look at energy security. It's not about protecting a fleet of coal-bearing ships that are coming in for countries that are really concerned about this. And it's not about protecting trade access to hydrocarbon producing nations, et cetera, et cetera. So it offers this energy security, but over and above that, it is a large scale industrial complex across many, many different components, across many, many different vendors of equipment. And to be able to spearhead as a sovereign nation an industry that can deliver infrastructure of the scale and complexity and longevity of nuclear power plants, I think if America wants to remain one of the largest economies in the world throughout the 21st century, it absolutely needs to play in this game. And when you start to look at some of the trajectories that I believe nuclear power will experience because of the factors we've talked about, to remain outside of an energy source that's likely to comprise 20% of the growth going forward for a large country like America just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Okay. And how much role do you think the fact that they've got this huge nuclear fleet as well? I mean, that seems a very important thing for them. They've got these floating nuclear reactors all around the world. Is that a larger part of the consideration?
Well, it is with the current administration. So we've seen a lot of focus on technology and IP from the Trump administration, and there's much of that that's driving, of course, the trade tensions between the US and China right now. But where the next generation of nuclear reactors, the so-called small modular reactors, play an important role is, as with the broader industry, America was streets ahead. They had the first regulated or approved or authorized SMR reactor and have done almost nothing with it in the last 5 years. And what we've seen is we've seen Japan, but in particular China and Russia, catch up to that technology because China and Russia, they can make available commercial scale pilots for all of these, whether it's floating reactors or other small modular reactors. The Trump administration has realized that they do have time to catch this issue. And so we've seen a lot of spending come in and also a lot of talk just in the last year about expediting availability and permitting and approval so that they can get commercial scale SMR and Gen 4 reactors into action. Now, going back to my point about technology and IP, to be at the forefront of such an important new technology is very attractive to a country like the United States. For various reasons, but partly and largely because they need to maintain their competitiveness of their manufacturing industry, and technology is the only way they're going to be able to do that in the coming decades compared to a workforce like China.
Okay. I think there's a lot more to be discussed around the US component, but I don't want this to be a US-centric interview. But just to finish off the geopolitics component, obviously China, Russia, Kazakhs, all in terms of proximity to where you're based, Africa, they all have their foot through the door in a lot of those countries already with other commodities, obviously. Are you seeing or have you been approached by those types of players and with regards to securing future production, or is that a conversation that has not been had? And if it, in fact, is it a conversation that you'd be allowed to have?
Well, it's a conversation that I won't have at the moment. It would be foolish to have those types of conversations as we are only just bottoming out of an 8-year bear market. But to answer your question about are we seeing it, absolutely we're seeing it. If you look at China, for example, we saw CGN acquire Extract Resources and Kalahari Minerals for $2.4 billion US, and then proceed to spend somewhere between 2 and 3 billion building the Husab uranium mine and continue to operate that mine in circumstances where clearly it's uneconomic at the current prices. So the fact that they're prepared to continue pushing with that mine and producing rather than acquiring in the spot market says a lot about their long-term ambitions and their long-term requirements to not only acquire production certainty moving forward, but acquire expertise and demonstrate that China is capable of building and running what was one of only 2 multi-billion-dollar resources developments in Africa in the last 10 years. Now, the same can be said for Russia. They acquired during the last boom the Mkuju River project in Tanzania for over $1 billion, and they have very close relationships with the large-scale production that we see in Kazakhstan. And Uranium One, which is a state-owned entity owned by the Russians, operates more joint ventures in Kazakhstan than any other company other than Kazatomprom, of course. But that extends beyond that. We have India, who has finally started to achieve some genuine traction with their nuclear program after several years of false starts. They have an aggressive program to not only stockpile uranium, but to start securing their own supply certainty. And South Korea has demonstrated in the UAE that they can build on time and efficiently reactors, and they must be eyeing a significant export market to complement their other heavy industries, such as shipping and so forth. So there are multiple players that have a keen interest in securing large-scale certainty of supply. And that's what you have in Africa. The projects are much bigger. They tend to be higher on the cost curve, but they offer a unique form of security of supply because large nations have got greater geopolitical influence with African countries. I'm not saying they misuse that influence. In fact, I'm saying quite the contrary. Most African countries benefit enormously from that investment, but they do have the influence to be able to secure and protect their own investments. But on top of that, the role of interest groups and the role of adversaries to uranium mining in the nuclear sector, they simply don't get any real traction whatsoever in Africa because their development agenda is so strong, and governments in Africa have been through that, whether it's uranium mining, other mining, all sorts of other activist groups, and they've learned to put the interest of their citizens and their prosperity well ahead of whatever television screens might fill up with in Europe or the US.